In 1804, a respected Quranic teacher left his home in the highlands of Guinea to purchase a paper for his school. He had a wife, 3 children, a position of honor in his community. Within days, he would wake up in chains, stripped of his name, his identity, and his freedom. For the next 3 decades, the man who once taught scripture to eager students would pick cotton under a blazing sun. His education considered worthless, his literacy illegal, his very humanity denied. His American masters would call him Paul. His real name was Lamine Kebe. This is his story. The highlands of Fouta Djallon, in what we now call Guinea, were, in the early 19th century, one of West Africa's great centers of Islamic learning. Founded in 1725 as an Islamic imamate following a religious revolution, Fouta Djallon had transformed from a region of traditional African religions into a theocratic state where Islam shaped every aspect of society. The capital city of Timbo and the holy city of Fugumba housed mosques, schools, and libraries that rivaled the famous centers of Timbuktu and Djenné. Students traveled from across West Africa to study under the region's renowned scholars, memorizing the Quran in Arabic, studying Islamic law, and mastering the arts of teaching and jurisprudence. In this world of scholarship and devotion, Lamine Kebe had found his calling. Born around 1780 to a prominent family, Kebe dedicated his life to Islamic education. He became a Quranic teacher, following a tradition that stretched back centuries in West Africa. The educational system in Fouta Djallon was rigorous and comprehensive. Children as young as 6 began their studies, learning to recite verses from the Quran, to write in Arabic script, and to understand the principles of Islamic law and morality. Advanced students might spend years, even decades, perfecting their knowledge, until they could recite the entire Quran from memory and interpret its meanings with scholarly precision. Kebe wasn't just any teacher. He came from an educated family where learning was prized above almost everything else. He would later tell Americans that his aunt was more learned than himself, eminent for her superior accomplishments and celebrated for her skills in teaching. This wasn't unusual in Fouta Djallon, where women as well as men could achieve recognition as scholars. Education wasn't merely about religious devotion, it was the foundation of social standing, of community leadership, of one's very identity. To be educated in Arabic, to understand the Quran, to teach others, these accomplishments marked a person as civilized, as worthy of respect, as fully human in the Islamic worldview that dominated the region. By 1804, Kebe had established himself as a schoolmaster. He had married and fathered 3 children. His days followed a rhythm familiar to teachers across the centuries, waking before dawn for morning prayers, teaching students who came to learn their letters and memorize sacred verses, engaging in scholarly discussions with other learned men, maintaining the materials necessary for education. And materials were essential. In a world where literacy meant everything, where the written word connected believers to God and to each other, the tools of writing, ink, parchment, paper, were precious commodities. When Kebe's supply of paper ran low, he did what any conscientious teacher would do. He set out to purchase more. The journey from his home to the markets where he could buy paper should have been routine. Fouta Djallon's location in the highlands meant it sat astride major trade routes connecting the interior of West Africa to the Atlantic coast. Caravans regularly passed through, carrying gold, ivory, leather goods, and enslaved people captured in the endless wars between African kingdoms. Paper, imported from North Africa or Europe, could be purchased from merchants who plied these routes. Kebe would have been well known as a scholar, a man of standing, someone who moved with the protection that education and social status conferred in his society. But something went terribly wrong. The details of Kebe's capture remain sparse in the historical record. What we know is this. Sometime around 1804, possibly during a journey to Timbuktu or another trading center to purchase paper, Kebe was seized by slave raiders. One account suggests he was captured at night, waking to find himself in fetters. Whether he was betrayed by someone who knew his route, whether he was simply in the wrong place when raiders struck, whether war or political upheaval had made the roads suddenly dangerous, we cannot say with certainty. What we do know is that the scholar became property, the teacher became merchandise, the free man became a slave. The system that ensnared Kebe was ancient and vast. Slavery had existed in Africa for centuries, taking many forms, from domestic servitude to pawn slavery to captives taken in war. But the arrival of European traders on the West African coast in the 15th century had transformed the scale and nature of the slave trade beyond recognition. The insatiable demand for labor in the Americas, where European colonizers had built vast plantation economies producing sugar, tobacco, coffee, and cotton, created an unprecedented market for human beings. By the early 1800s, an estimated 15 to 20% of enslaved Africans brought to the Americas were Muslims, many of them educated, literate, from the scholarly and ruling classes of West African Islamic states. The process of enslavement followed a brutal pattern. Once captured, victims were marched to the coast in coffles, chains connecting multiple captives at the neck or ankle. These journeys could cover hundreds of miles and take weeks or months. Many died along the way from exhaustion, disease, malnutrition, or deliberate violence. Those who survived reached the coastal slave forts, stone fortresses built by European powers, where they were imprisoned while waiting for slave ships to arrive. Elmina, Goree Island, Bunce Island. These names mark sites of unimaginable suffering, where hundreds of thousands of Africans spent their last days on their native continent packed in underground dungeons, branded like cattle, stripped of everything they had known. For Kebe, an educated Muslim scholar, the experience must have been particularly devastating. His entire identity rested on his learning, his piety, his role as a teacher and community leader. Islamic law, which he had studied and taught, explicitly addressed the question of slavery. Scholars like Ahmed Baba of Timbuktu had argued in the 16th century that Muslims could not be enslaved, that captives from Muslim countries must not be reduced to slavery, that all men are born free. These principles were clear, yet they meant nothing to the slave raiders who had seized Kebe, nothing to the merchants who would sell him, nothing to the Europeans who would transport him across the ocean. The Middle Passage that carried Kebe to America was a nightmare of industrial efficiency in human trafficking. Slave ships were specifically designed to transport as many captives as possible, while maintaining just enough of them alive to turn a profit. The slave deck, where captives were held for the voyage, might be only 3 feet high. Men, women, and children were chained together, packed side by side, head to foot, unable to sit upright, lying in their own waste for weeks or months. The heat, the stench, the darkness, the constant motion of the ship, the screams of the dying. This was the reality of the Middle Passage. Deaths from suffocation, disease, malnutrition, and despair were routine. Some captains threw sick or injured Africans overboard to claim insurance on the lost cargo. Suicide attempts were common, as were desperate rebellions, most of which ended in massacre. We don't know which ship carried Kebe across the Atlantic, or where exactly he landed, or how many of his fellow captives survived the journey. What we do know is that by the early 19th century, slave ships were depositing their human cargo at ports throughout the American South. Some went to Charleston, South Carolina, others to Savannah, Georgia, others to smaller ports along the coast. From these arrival points, enslaved people were sold at auction or in smaller trading venues to plantation owners, merchants, and slave traders who would transport them to their final destinations: cotton plantations in Alabama and Mississippi, rice plantations in the Carolinas and Georgia, sugar plantations in Louisiana. The man who had been Lamine Kebe was given a new name. His masters called him Paul. This renaming was standard practice, a deliberate erasure of identity that reinforced the transformation of person into property. Slave names were often simple, biblical, or mocking. They marked ownership, denied heritage, severed the captive's connection to their past. For Kebe, I saw a man whose very name connected him to his family, his community, his faith. This theft of identity must have cut deep. But he had no choice. In the legal framework of American slavery, he was chattel, a thing to be bought and sold, with no more right to name himself than a horse or a plow. For approximately 30 to 40 years, sources differ on the exact duration, Lamine Kebe lived as a slave in the American South, moving between at least 3 different southern states. The specifics of his enslavement, where exactly he labored, which plantations he worked, who owned him, remain frustratingly vague in the historical record. This is typical for enslaved people. Slave owners kept meticulous records of their property, noting purchases, sales, and deaths in account books, but they rarely recorded the inner lives, the thoughts, the feelings of the human beings they owned. Kebe's story survives only because his education and literacy made him unusual enough to attract attention late in his life. What we can reconstruct, based on what we know of slavery in the Cotton South during the early 1800s, paints a grim picture. The vast majority of enslaved people in states like Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina worked in agricultural labor, primarily cotton cultivation. Cotton was king in the antebellum South, driving the entire regional economy and making slave owners wealthy beyond measure. The labor that produced this wealth was backbreaking. During planting season, enslaved people worked from sunup to sundown, preparing fields, sowing seeds, tending crops. During harvest, the workday stretched even longer, with quotas demanding that each person pick hundreds of pounds of cotton daily. Those who failed to meet their quotas faced the whip. For an educated Muslim scholar accustomed to the life of a teacher, this work must have been especially jarring. Kebe had spent his adult life with books and students, engaged in intellectual and spiritual pursuits. Now his hands, which had held pens and turned pages, picked cotton bolls. His mind, which had memorized the Quran and debated fine points of Islamic law, had to focus on survival, on avoiding punishment, on enduring heat and exhaustion and monotony day after day after day. The system of slavery was designed to break people, to reduce them to labor machines, to strip away everything that made them human beyond their capacity to work. Literacy among enslaved people was not just discouraged, it was illegal in most southern states by the 1830s. After Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, when an enslaved preacher who could read led a violent uprising in Virginia, southern states passed increasingly harsh anti-literacy laws. In South Carolina, teaching a slave to read or write could result in fines of $100 and 6 months in prison. In Georgia, the penalty could be a fine of $500 plus whipping. The logic was clear. Literacy meant access to ideas, to abolitionist writings, to the very concept of freedom. An enslaved person who could read might forge a pass and escape. An enslaved person who could read might organize resistance. Better to keep them ignorant, to make sure they had no tools beyond their bodies. But Kebe could read and write, not in English, but in Arabic. He had been educated in one of West Africa's premier centers of learning. He had spent years, perhaps decades, studying the Quran, Islamic law, Arabic grammar, and poetry. This education was core to his identity. Even in bondage, even after years of forced labor, he maintained his literacy. Enslaved Muslims across the American South found ways to practice their faith and preserve their learning despite the hostile environment. They prayed 5 times a day, turning toward Mecca when possible. They observed Ramadan, fasting despite the physical demands of plantation labor. They refused to eat pork, maintaining Islamic dietary laws even when it meant going hungry. And they wrote, using whatever materials they could find, scratching verses from the Quran into the dirt with sticks, writing on wooden tablets with plant juices, keeping their language and their learning alive. The contrast between Kebe's education and that of his masters was stark and deeply ironic. In the early 19th century, literacy rates among white Southerners were far from universal. Many slave owners themselves could barely read or write. Public education barely existed in the South before the Civil War. Yet these men, many of them functionally illiterate or barely educated, owned human beings who were more learned, more intellectually accomplished than they would ever be. Kebe would later observe, with what must have been enormous restraint, that there are good men in America, but all are very ignorant of Africa. This statement captures the fundamental paradox of his situation. His captors believed Africans were inferior, primitive, barely human. Yet here was an African who had received an education that surpassed theirs, who could read and write in a language they couldn't understand, who carried in his mind centuries of scholarly tradition. White Americans who encountered literate enslaved Muslims struggled to reconcile this reality with their racial ideology. To maintain the fiction that Africans were intellectually inferior and therefore suited for slavery, they created elaborate justifications. Some claimed that literate Muslims weren't really African, but rather Arab or Moorish, denying their black African identity to preserve racist assumptions. Others treated them as exotic curiosities, fascinating aberrations who proved nothing about the capacity of Africans in general. The term Moor was applied to educated Muslim slaves like Kebe, a linguistic sleight of hand that allowed white Americans to acknowledge their learning while denying that black Africans could be educated. The isolation Kebe must have felt cannot be overstated. He was surrounded by people who shared his condition of enslavement, but often not his language, his religion, his educational background. While historians estimate that 15 to 20% of enslaved Africans brought to America were Muslims, they were scattered across the South, often the only Muslim on their particular plantation. Kebe couldn't openly practice his faith without risking punishment. He couldn't teach, which had been his life's work. He couldn't connect with other scholars to discuss theology or law or literature. His education, which in Futa Jalan would have earned him respect and status, was worthless in Alabama or Georgia or wherever he labored. Worse than worthless, it was dangerous, something to be hidden lest it mark him as rebellious or uppity. Yet Kebe survived. For 3 decades he endured. He worked in the fields. He avoided the worst punishments. He kept his faith and his learning alive in secret, and he watched, observed, learned about the country that held him captive. By the time he encountered white abolitionists and colonization advocates in the 1830s, he had developed sophisticated understandings of American society, its contradictions, its cruelties, its rare examples of kindness. He had learned to navigate a world designed to destroy him, and somehow, against all odds, he had preserved enough of himself to tell his story. By 1834, Kebe was an old man, worn down by decades of slavery. The historical record suggests he was freed sometime around that year, though the circumstances remain unclear. His last master, described as a Christian, liberated him, perhaps out of religious conviction, perhaps because Kebe was too old to be profitable. But this freedom came with massive limitations. Kebe was free in name only. He had no money, no resources, no support system. He was free in a country that despised free black people perhaps even more than it tolerated enslaved ones. Free blacks in the South faced constant harassment, were required to carry papers proving their status, could be kidnapped back into slavery at any time. Some states were actively trying to expel free blacks entirely, passing laws requiring them to leave or face re-enslavement. Somehow, Kebe made his way to New York City, one of the northern urban centers where free blacks could find some measure of safety and community. There, he encountered members of the American Colonization Society, an organization that would shape the final chapter of his American story. The ACS, founded in 1816, advocated for sending free black Americans to Africa, specifically to the colony of Liberia, which the society had established on the West African coast. The organization's motives were complex and often contradictory. Some members were genuine abolitionists who believed black Americans could never achieve equality in the United States and would be better off in Africa. Others were racist Southerners who simply wanted to remove free blacks from America, seeing them as a threat to the slave system and to white supremacy. For freed slaves like Kebe, the ACS presented an agonizing choice: return to Africa, but not to their homelands, not to the places where they had families and communities, but to Liberia, a colony of American settlers hundreds of miles from where most had originated. Or remain in America, where freedom meant poverty, discrimination, constant danger, and the knowledge that millions remained in bondage. Many free blacks despised the ACS, seeing it correctly as a tool to strengthen slavery by removing free blacks who might inspire or assist those still enslaved. But for some, especially African-born people like Kebe, who remembered their homelands, the promise of return, even to the wrong part of Africa, held enormous appeal. Kebe needed the ACS. He was old, alone, destitute. He wanted to go home, even if home was now 500 miles from where Liberia's coast would land him. The ACS had ships, resources, connections. But they wanted something from Kebe, too. The society was deeply interested in educated African Muslims, seeing them as valuable assets for their colonization project. Theodore Dwight, a prominent member of the American Ethnological Society and a supporter of colonization, interviewed Kebe extensively in 1834 and 1835, recording his stories, his observations about Africa, his knowledge of Islam. Dwight presented this information to the American Lyceum to promote educational reforms and to demonstrate the sophistication of African cultures, though always in service of the colonization project. To secure passage to Africa, Kebe made a stunning compromise. Though he remained a devout Muslim, had maintained his Islamic faith through 30 years of slavery despite enormous pressure to convert to Christianity, Kebe now claimed he wished to become a Christian missionary in Africa. This was almost certainly a lie, a desperate stratagem by a man who had learned that white Americans would only help him if he framed his desires in terms they found acceptable. The ACS loved the idea of African converts returning to Christianize the continent. Kebe told them what they wanted to hear. In his conversations with Theodore Dwight and other Americans, Kebe shared extensive knowledge about West Africa, its geography, its Islamic education system, its political structures. He described the widespread availability of schooling in what he called Nigrisha, explaining that all children had access to instruction in basic reading and writing. He spoke of his own education, of his aunt's superior learning, of the deep intellectual traditions of Futa Jalan. To Americans who believed Africans were savages, these accounts were revelatory. They confirmed what a growing number of scholars and abolitionists suspected, that Africa had civilizations, cultures, educational systems that rivaled Europe's in sophistication and antiquity. But Kebe's observations about America were equally significant. His comment that there are good men in America, but all are very ignorant of Africa captures perfectly the tragic irony of his situation. He had spent decades among Americans, had been owned by them, had watched them, and had come to understand them perhaps better than they understood themselves. Yes, some Americans were kind. Some opposed slavery. Some recognized the humanity of black people. But almost all of them, even the well-meaning ones, knew nothing about Africa. They could not conceive that the continent had produced scholars, artists, architects, legal systems, universities. Their ignorance enabled their cruelty. If they had known, truly known, what they were destroying when they enslaved people like Kebe, could they have continued? Kebe seemed to think not, or at least he hoped not. In late 1834 or early 1835, Lamine Kebe boarded a ship bound for Liberia. After more than 3 decades in America, 30 years of slavery, he was finally leaving. The voyage would have been bitterly ironic, crossing the same ocean that had brought him in chains, but now sailing in the opposite direction. When he reached Liberia's shores, he found a struggling colony of American settlers, former slaves and free blacks trying to build lives in a land that was foreign to most of them. Liberia was not Futa Jalan. The people there spoke English, not the languages Kebe knew. They practiced Christianity, not Islam. They were 500 miles from his homeland, from his family, if any still lived, from everything he had known before his capture. What happened to Lamine Kebe after he reached Liberia remains a mystery. The historical record goes silent. Some sources suggest he died around 1835, worn out by age and the hardships he had endured. Others offer no information at all. We don't know if he ever made it back to Futa Jalan, if he reunited with family, if he lived out his final years teaching again, if he died in Liberia a stranger in a strange land. This silence, this absence of information about the end of his life, is itself telling. Enslaved people, even the exceptional ones whose stories partially survived, disappeared into history. Their lives after freedom, assuming they achieved it, rarely made it into the records that historians rely on. Kebe's final chapter is lost. Closing sequence. Lamine. Kebe's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the transatlantic slave trade and American slavery. The standard narrative, the one most Americans learned, if they learned anything at all, presents enslaved people as uneducated field hands, people who needed the civilizing influence of their Christian masters. Kebe's life demolishes this lie. Here was a man who received an education that surpassed that of most white Americans of his era. He could read and write fluently in Arabic. He had memorized the Quran. He had taught students for years. Yet the same country that prided itself on enlightenment and learning treated him as property, denied him the right to read or write, forced him to labor in fields, and called him by a name that wasn't his own. His story is not unique. Historians now estimate that between 15 and 20% of enslaved Africans brought to the Americas were Muslims. Many came from the scholarly and ruling classes of West African Islamic states. People like Abd al-Rahman, a prince from Futa Jalan who spent 40 years enslaved in Mississippi before gaining freedom. People like Omar ibn Said, a scholar who wrote his autobiography in Arabic while enslaved in North Carolina. People like Bilali Muhammad, a plantation manager in Georgia who maintained his Islamic faith and left behind Arabic manuscripts. These were not exceptions. They represented a significant portion of the enslaved population, educated Muslims whose learning and literacy challenged everything their captors believed about African inferiority. The impact of this educated Muslim minority on American slavery was significant. Their literacy made them valuable as plantation managers, accountants, and overseers, though also more dangerous in the eyes of slave owners who feared educated slaves might foment rebellion. Their resistance to conversion to Christianity was notable and persistent, as they maintained Islamic prayers, dietary restrictions, and naming practices even under tremendous pressure. Some scholars argue that Muslim slaves, because of their education and organizational skills, played outsized roles in slave rebellions, though this remains a subject of historical debate. What is not debatable is the cultural legacy they left behind. The blues, that quintessentially American art form, may have roots in West African Islamic musical traditions, specifically in the style of Quranic recitation. The long, bending, swooping notes characteristic of blues singing mirror the melodic patterns of Islamic calls to prayer. Certain words and phrases in African American vernacular English may derive from Arabic. Some African American family names, particularly in coastal Georgia and South Carolina, likely come from Muslim names that were anglicized or corrupted over generations. The culture of the Gula Geechee people shows clear Islamic influences, from naming patterns to food traditions to storytelling styles. But these cultural traces are faint, fragmentary, the echoes of a culture that was systematically destroyed. Islam did not survive as a living tradition among African Americans the way other cultural forms did. By the early 20th century, no Muslim communities descended from enslaved Africans remained in the United States. The faith that Kebe and thousands of others maintained through suffering and oppression was lost, erased by the brutal machinery of slavery and its aftermath. When Islam returned to African American communities in the 20th century, with movements like the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam, it came as something new, influenced by the history of slavery, but not descended directly from it. Kebe's observation that Americans were ignorant of Africa resonates today. In the 21st century, Americans still know remarkably little about African history, African cultures, African achievements. The stereotype of Africa as a primitive continent without civilization or learning persists, despite centuries of scholarship demonstrating otherwise. The medieval empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. The great university at Timbuktu, where students studied astronomy, mathematics, law, and medicine. The sophisticated ironworking technologies of sub-Saharan Africa. The complex political systems of states like Futajalan. The rich literary traditions preserved in thousands of Arabic manuscripts. All of this is erased or forgotten in popular American consciousness, replaced by images of grass huts and tribal warfare. This ignorance is not accidental. It serves a purpose. If Americans acknowledged that Africa had produced civilizations as sophisticated as Europe's, had scholars as learned as European scholars, had built cities and universities and legal systems, then the entire justification for slavery and colonialism collapses. You cannot claim to be civilizing savages if the people you are enslaving are already civilized, often more educated than you are. The deliberate erasure of African achievement, the systematic denial of African humanity, was essential to the slave system. And it continues today, perpetuated by education systems that teach little of African history, by media representations that present Africa as monolithically poor and primitive, by the lingering effects of centuries of racist ideology. Lamine Kebe spent 30 years in America. He picked cotton on plantations whose exact locations we cannot determine. He was called by a name that was not his own. He was bought and sold as property. He maintained his faith in secret, practiced his literacy in hiding, endured the daily violence and degradation of slavery. When freedom finally came, it came too late, when he was old and broken, and it came with the condition that he leave the only country he had known as an adult. He agreed to return to Africa, but not to his home, not to the place where his family and community might still exist, but to a colony of American settlers on the wrong part of the coast. What was lost when Lamine Kebe was captured in 1804? A teacher lost his students. Children lost their schoolmaster. A community lost a scholar. A family lost a husband and father. And Kebe himself lost his home, his freedom, his name, and 30 years of his life. What did America gain? The labor of one man for 3 decades, cotton picked, fields tended, profits extracted. When he finally told his story to Theodore Dwight in New York, he provided something more valuable, testimony to the humanity, the learning, the civilization of Africa. But by then it was too late. The damage was done. He was an old man heading into exile, and behind him lay the wreckage of a life that could have been. His story is one of millions. Between 12 and 15 million Africans were forced across the Atlantic in the transatlantic slave trade. Each one had a name before they were renamed by their captors. Each one had a life, a family, a place in their community. Some were farmers, some were artisans, some were princes and scholars and teachers. The system of slavery stripped all of them of their identities, reduced them to units of labor, denied their humanity. The fact that we know anything about Lamine Kebe at all is unusual. The vast majority of enslaved people left no records, no testimony, no trace in the historical archive beyond entries in account books noting their purchase or sale or death. Yet their descendants built America. The wealth of the antebellum South, the economic foundation that financed northern industrialization, the capital that funded westward expansion, all of it rested on stolen labor, on the forced work of people like Lamine Kebe, who were given no choice, no compensation, no recognition. They cleared the land. They planted the crops. They built the buildings. They nursed the children of their enslavers while their own children were sold away. They cooked the food and made the clothes and did the back-breaking labor that generated fortunes for white families while receiving nothing themselves. And then, when slavery finally ended, their contributions were erased, minimized, forgotten. Lamine Kebe deserved better. He deserved to live his life as a teacher in Fouta Djallon, to watch his children grow, to pursue his studies, to grow old surrounded by respect and community. Instead, he spent his prime years in bondage, his education wasted, his potential crushed. When he finally gained freedom, it came in the form of exile. He made it back to Africa, sort of, but not to home. And then the historical record loses him, and we don't even know how or when he died. His story survives only in fragments, glimpses recorded by white Americans who interviewed him late in his life, who were fascinated by his learning but never quite grasped the magnitude of what had been stolen from him. We have Theodore Dwight's notes describing Kebe's knowledge of West African education systems. We have a few quotations attributed to him, including his observation about American ignorance of Africa. We have the bare facts. Quranic teacher, captured around 1804, enslaved for approximately 30 years, freed around 1834, sent to Liberia, died sometime thereafter. That's it. That's all that remains of a life that spanned at least 5 decades, crossed an ocean twice, endured horrors we can barely imagine. But even these fragments matter. They remind us that enslaved people were individuals with stories, with education, with families and dreams and identities that existed before and beyond their enslavement. They challenge the narratives that present slavery as somehow benign, as a system where contented workers were cared for by benevolent masters. There was nothing benign about what happened to Lamine Kebe. He was kidnapped. He was trafficked across an ocean. He was forced to work for decades without pay. He was denied the right to practice his religion, to use his education, to even keep his name. This was theft on a scale almost beyond comprehension, the theft of a life, of a future, of human dignity itself. And it happened to millions of people. Lamine Kebe's story is remarkable because we know it, because he was educated enough and unusual enough to leave traces in the historical record. But for every Lamine Kebe whose name we know, there are thousands whose names are lost forever, who suffered the same horrors, the same injustices, the same brutal erasure. They picked cotton and planted rice and cut sugarcane and died young, and are buried in unmarked graves throughout the American South. No one recorded their stories. No one preserved their names. They are gone, and all that remains is the wealth they created, wealth that still shapes American society today, still divides along the color line that slavery created. Lamine Kebe told Theodore Dwight that there are good men in America, but all are very ignorant of Africa. More than a century and a half later, this ignorance persists. We still don't teach African history in American schools with any depth or seriousness. We still don't reckon honestly with what slavery was, what it destroyed, what it created. We still don't acknowledge that America was built on stolen labor, that the comfortable existence many Americans enjoy rests on a foundation of suffering and injustice that has never been adequately addressed or redressed. Lamine Kebe knew this. He lived it. He tried to tell us about it. We should have listened. The teacher from Fouta Djallon never made it home. He spent his final days in a place that was not his, among people who were not his people, separated from everything he had known and loved. This exile, this permanent displacement, was the final cruelty in a life defined by cruelty. But his story survives, and in that survival there is a kind of resistance, a refusal to be completely erased. Lamine Kebe was here. He existed. He mattered. He was not just Paul the slave, property to be bought and sold. He was Lamine Kebe, scholar, teacher, husband, father, a man who maintained his dignity and his faith through decades of oppression. His name deserves to be remembered. His story deserves to be told. And the system that destroyed him deserves to be named for what it was: an atrocity, a crime against humanity, a sin for which America has never fully atoned.